Thank you, and thank you everybody for being so patient. It was a little bit tricky trying to get into Idaho Falls yesterday. I don't think any flights came in at all. And it was a long walk from Denver that I got here. So, I was going to be your... Oh, a clicker. My goodness. That's got about 500 buttons on it. The green one. And what about if you want to go backwards? What do I have to point it at something? All right, what happened then? Lovely. Red is back. Good. So I have some very bright lights shining in my eyes, and unfortunately I can't see you. But I want to make this interactive if possible. So if I don't see you, can you please wave your arm around? I've been asked today to talk about how carbon gets into soil. So I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly because I gather that most of you would already actually know this, but it probably doesn't hurt to reinforce it, because when you're absolutely sure of how it happens, it makes it much easier to focus on those processes when you're thinking about building soil. So I guess the first thing we have to ask actually what is soil and by what processes does it form, because those are the processes that we're going to be working on when we're building topsoil. And we have tended to look at soil as being the foundation of everything. Almost, obviously, if you pick up a soils textbook, it's going to say soil is the foundation of everything. When people talk about soil health, they often talk about soil being the foundation of everything. And that makes us focus on soil, which is a bit unfortunate, really, because as it turns out, it's not the foundation. And the problem with thinking that soil is the basis of everything that we do, it's understandable that we look at it that way, because that's what we grow our plants in, and that's our animals stand on that. We build our houses on that. Trees grow in that. It is, in some ways, it is at the base of the pyramid, and because we think of it in that kind of a structure, if our plants aren't working as we'd like them, they aren't functioning as well as we'd like them to, or our animals aren't growing as fast as we'd like them to, we tend to think there's something wrong with the soil and that we need to fix it. And then we'll go and we'll take a soil test and we'll send it off to the lab and we'll expose it to all kinds of chemicals that it's never seen in its life that are totally irrelevant, really, for soil, and we'll come up with some numbers and say, oh, the soil isn't working because it doesn't have enough nitrogen in it, or it doesn't have enough phosphorus in it, or it doesn't have enough calcium or something, and then we try to fix it. We go out and buy some nitrogen, or we go out and buy some phosphorus, and we think, well, if we add these to the soil, because the soil test showed we didn't have enough of them, that will fix our problem. And we've been doing that since the end of the Second World War. And we've now ended up with soil that's even in worse shape than it was 50 or 70 years ago. And it's still deteriorating. And this problem is global. It's around the world. We have soils deteriorating and people putting more and more and more stuff on, as they call it, the moron principle, and wondering why their soils still aren't getting any better. So this structure that we have as to how soil works, or what soil is actually fundamentally wrong. And that's where we have erroneously gone down this path and unfortunately spend a lot of money and create a lot of hardship for people. And just, I get to see a lot of soils in a lot of different parts of the world, and it's a pretty sad story because most of them aren't functioning effectively. Now, some of you in this room are doing things to change that, and just from what I saw of the last presentation, getting a diversity of plants growing there, having animals in contact with the soil, all those kinds of things are working to restore soil, and we have to look at, well, why is it that those things are so effective in restoring soil? So how does soil actually work, and why do those things work? And then when we understand that, we can see where it is that we need to put our effort into restoring our soils. So starting with that structure, and then my question now is, well, what if soil is not the base of the pyramid of life? Have we actually been directing our energies to the wrong thing? So what is soil? So the lights have been turned down a little bit, so I can kind of half see you now. So does anybody want to make some suggestions as to what soil actually is? That stuff that you all have on your farms, that you all use. It is the basis of your production system. But what is it, actually? What is it made of? If I had a bucket of it here, up here on the stage, if I had a bucket of soil, what would I have a bucket of? Minerals, organic matter and biology. Yep. And how much if I had... well, I can't think in metric, but let me think of a number, like maybe 20 pounds. Does that sound reasonable? 20 pounds, 50 pounds or something, a number like that, of soil in a bucket. Would that fit in a bucket? I don't know. I don't know what a pound is really, but anyway, so let's say I got 20 pounds of soil here, and how much of that would be minerals, do you think? I mean, I know there's going to be some air in there. We'll forget about that. We've got, like, the bit that actually weighs 20 pounds. I've got 20 pounds of soil here. How many pounds of that do you think is probably minerals? Less than 1 pound? 85. Oh, we've got a bit of variation of opinion here. Any other numbers? Somewhere between 1 or 85, or even more than 85. How much of that 20 pounds do you think is actually minerals? So let me ask another question. What else? You said it had minerals and it had biology and it had organic matter. So how much of the 20 pounds do you think might have been organic, might be organic matter? The person who said we had 1 pound of minerals, what do you think the other 19 pounds are? Not organic matter. Well, that's a good answer. So if the other 19 pounds aren't organic matter and they're not minerals, what do you think they might be? Well, I was putting carbon in with organic matter at the moment. I'm actually going to explain that in a moment about the difference between carbon and organic matter, but just for the moment we're going to call it all organic matter, because if we send it off to the lab, there is one useful thing you can get a lab to test, and that is how much carbon is in your soil. So in our 20 pounds, how much carbon do you think we might have? Just for typical soil here in Idaho Falls. Anyone had a soil test done that lives in this area that could tell me how much carbon was in their soil? As a percentage. Let's do it as a percentage. Anyone got a soil test could tell me how much? Marlon's looking at me, but is there anybody else that has a soil test that could tell me? 2%. So Marlon's saying 2%. So what's 2% of 20? 4. Half. Someone give me what? 24. What is 2% of 20? About half a pound. All right. So we had 20 pounds, and we're saying half a pound of it is organic matter. So we've got 19.5 pounds of some other stuff in there. It's all minerals. Yes, a hand down the back. Yeah, okay, so, and that's what minerals are, right? So if rock decomposes, breaks down somehow or another, it forms rock minerals, and basically that your soil is decomposed rock, parent material of some kind. It might have been basalt rock, it might have been granite rock, it might have been sandstone, it could have been shale, like all these different kinds of rock are going to end up producing different kinds of mineral composition in your soil, but it is going to be basically a bucket full of minerals. That's what soil is. And when it's out there in the field, we hope it's going to have some air in it. So if we're looking at it on a volumetric basis, we would want about half of it to actually be air, but obviously that's not going to weigh anything. And we'd want about a quarter of it to be water. But if we're just looking at it on a dry weight basis, it's going to be mostly minerals and a little bit of carbon. As Marlon said, 2% maybe. Some people might have less than 1% carbon. In Australia, when land was first colonised by Europeans and some soil samples were sent back to England to be analysed, the carbon content ranged from about 5% to 37%. 5 to 37%. There was 41 soil samples were sent on a sailing ship back to England, back to Kew, which is where there was a big museum, and they analysed. There was also a lot of plant samples sent back for analysis. 41 samples, the average was between 5 and 37%, and the average of that was 20%. Now, across Australia, nearly all of our soils have less than 1% carbon. Right, so soil is decomposed rock minerals, weathered rock minerals, sand, silt and clay, that if we're going to actually call it soil and we want it to function for us, like as the basis for our crops and pastures, we want it to have lots of organic matter in it, right, and lots of life in it. We don't want just a bucket full of minerals, because you might as well just have a bucket full of sand or a bucket full of clay. That's not going to really grow productive crops for you. So the definition of soil, if it's topsoil, is actually those weathered rock materials that are or have been in contact with plant roots. So if you think of somewhere in the world where there aren't any plants because it's too cold or it's too hot or it's too dry, there's no topsoil there. If you think about it, if you've been somewhere, like maybe you've been to the Sahara Desert, or maybe you've been to the top of one of these mountains above the tree line where no plants grow because it's too cold, what do you find there? You find rocks and you find weathered rock materials, but you don't find topsoil. And if you think about maybe a track on your farm where you drive all the time and there's no plants growing there, eventually the soil deteriorates. You'll notice if you keep soil bare, it deteriorates. Even if you just had a patch where you weren't driving and you just kept spraying it all of the time or cultivating it all the time and keep it without plants living in it and growing in it, it will deteriorate. It will become more compacted over time if it doesn't have plants in it. So this is one of the reasons we want to have plants in our soil as much of the time as possible and actively growing, and I'm going to show you photographs of this, what actually happens, is because the plant roots are important. Why are the plant roots important? So we will never have weathered rock materials, we won't have this bucket of minerals actually turn into topsoil unless we have plants growing in it. So why is that? What's so special about plant roots? Why are they important? They have biology that's going to decompose. Can you elaborate a little? They produce exudates. What kinds of exudates do they produce? What is it like, just generally? You don't have to specify. Sugars and organic acids and some nitrogen compounds, yes. Lady down the back had her hand up, no? They're living. That's a very, very good point. That is an extremely good point, that the plant is a living thing, because it's that life that generates other life. And in this case, the plant is a living photosynthesizing thing, and that is the important point. What happens in photosynthesis is that those green leaves are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and converting it into all these amazing, like thousands of different carbon compounds that come out of plant roots. And there are signalling compounds and there are feeding compounds. So the plant, you think about it, if you were a seed and you germinate in a whole pile of minerals, decomposed weathered rock materials, and there's all the minerals that you need are there, but they're bound up with something. So calcium, for example, is going to be bound up with phosphorus, and elements have positive or negative charges and they bind together, and a plant root just sticking there in amongst all those minerals can't possibly extract anything that it needs. It has to have a relationship with microbes in the soil to get the things that it needs, and it needs to feed those microbes. So the microbes will produce enzymes to break those bonds and get whatever minerals it is that the plant needs. But in order to produce the enzymes, the plant needs to feed the microbes. So we now know, and we've only known this probably, we discovered this about 10 years ago actually in Australia. I need to bring that to your attention, that this was discovered in Australia. And then last year, one of your American scientists by the name of James White, how many of you have heard of James White talking about plants farming microbes? No, you haven't come across James White yet. Look him up. We discovered this process that we called rhizophagy, and James called it rhizophagy, but I guess that's because he's American. So I'm going to call it microbivory, just to avoid that issue about how you pronounce it. Microbivory means plants eating microbes. Plants farm microbes around their roots. They send out exudates for the kind of microbes that they want, lots of signalling molecules. They cultivate them and then they eat them. That's what microbivory is about. And then the microbe actually goes into the plant, is subjected to reactive oxygen, has all its nutrients stripped off it, and then exits the plant via the root hairs and rebuilds its cell walls and starts the whole process again. So the microbe doesn't die. It actually multiplies while it's inside the plant and then moves out into the soil system. So this afternoon, when I talk a little bit about microbes, I'm going to talk about what we now know about endophytes. These are microbes that live in the soil and also live in plants. They move from the soil into plants. And it's a very, very intricate communication system that goes on between a plant which is stuck in one place. And you think about it, that some plants live for hundreds of years stuck in the one place. And during that entire time, they need to feed from the soil. And if it was just extracting minerals that were close to their roots, then they would extract those in a very short amount of time and there'd be no food left. So their whole life cycle depends on them supporting microbes in the soil. And this is why plant roots are important, because they bring life to the soil, and that life that they support in the soil is what builds topsoil. So the carbon that's coming out of plant roots is not only feeding microbes in order to feed the plant, but is also building soil, because those carbon compounds and all the sticky substances that microbes produce while they're feeding around plant roots are really important for sticking soil particles together to make aggregates. And the aggregate is like a little pea-shaped lump that is the primary unit of soil function. If we have water-stable aggregates in soil, we have soil that doesn't erode easily, it's porous, it's friable, it's easy for water to get in there, it's easy for plants to grow in there. And those of you who are home gardeners, you recognise how lovely it is to have soil that you can basically, if you're putting little seedlings in, you could just dig it with your hand, right? Lovely and soft, it smells great. It's completely different to the kind of compacted hard soil that we come to associate, unfortunately, with farming many times. So this is why plant roots are important, because they're the conduit between the atmosphere and the soil. That's how the energy gets into the soil. That's what feeds the whole soil ecosystem and builds topsoil. So this photograph here is basically just a summary of green plants that are going to capture light energy and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they're going to combine those things into biochemical energy, translocate it into the soil system and build mineral soil into fertile, friable topsoil, which is what we want, the holy grail. So how can you tell whether your plants are building topsoil? You need a spade, dig them up, have a look. If you see lots of soil sticking around the roots, this is an indication that there are a lot of exudates coming out of the roots, and an indication that also there's a lot of farming of microbes going on. So in those riser sheaths where the soil all sticks to the plant roots, we call that a riser sheath. Some people call them dreadlocks. You see them especially on crops like oats and things will just have really distinct dreadlocks if they're functioning effectively. There's worlds within worlds inside those riser sheaths, and Not only are the plants actually eating microbes from within there, but they're also cultivating the ones that they want and obviously building topsoil, because what you're looking at there is topsoil being formed. If we take a close-up look inside the riser sheath, so over on the left is the edge of the plant, and over on the right is would be where the soil is, and it's that bit that's in between. This is the biological hotspot in soil. So when you dig up your plants, you don't necessarily need to have a microscope. If you see you have riser sheaths on the roots, then you know that you'll have this incredible amount of life happening there inside the riser sheath. And the more we look at it and investigate it scientifically, the more we realise just how extraordinary the life is in that area. If we looked at it at a lower level of magnification, you can see fungal hyphae there. Or I should have said in the previous photo that what you can see there, can you see the little droplets of, looks like honey, coloured like liquid? That's the exudates coming out of the plant. And the strands that you can see that look like spider web or something there, fungal hyphae. So there's a lot of different kinds of very beneficial fungi living around plant roots. And again, with soils, we know more and more that it is the fungi that are really important for protecting the plant and for building soil and for moving things around. So those fungal hyphae can move nutrients around, can move more water around, and will connect plants underground, as I'll talk a little bit more after lunch. They're basically the highway and the internet of soil. So the more beneficial fungi we have, the better. Now, if your new seedling is protected with a riser sheath and it has all these beneficial fungi living around the roots, there is no way that fungal pathogens can attack your seed. But what do? We put fungicide on seeds. We put insecticides on seeds. We put all kinds of poisons on seeds. High analysis fertilisers are poisons as well. And we don't get riser sheaths. We don't get this protection. So by the very nature of the way we conduct agriculture, we prevent this protective mechanism and this nurturing environment from being created around our seeds. And then we need more fungicides and more insecticides and more high analysis fertilisers, because this is how the plant protects itself and feeds itself. And you'll notice, I will show you some photos, and I'm sure you've all seen it, of what it looks like around a seed that's been treated. A treated seed doesn't have riser sheaths. A treated seed doesn't have roots with lots and lots of root hairs. A treated seed is basically a very unprotected, vulnerable seed that is now more likely to be attacked than one that's surrounded by biology. So at a lower level of magnification, we can see fungal hyphae strands there pulling the soil together, and this is what gives the soil a structure. So just show you an example. This photograph was just taken in Hungary just before Christmas, and this field was very, very compacted. It's been tilled for hundreds of years, and this was the first year that this farmer had put a cover crop in. And those of you who've been experimenting with cover crops, you know that sometimes in the early stages or the first year, and particularly in the early growth stages, they don't look all that great necessarily. So you look at that and you go, well, that's not an amazing cover crop that is put in there. But it is actually doing amazing things. It's very low diversity. I think it was oats, phacelia and radish. There might have been four things. I can't remember what the fourth thing was. But anyway, we dug a hole in there, had a look, and a very, very compacted soil. But even in this early stage, in this first year of a cover crop, when we have a look to see, so the compacted soil is on the left, that's what the whole field is like that, the soil is like that. And then on the right, you can see at the very early growth stage what those little seedling plants are doing in terms of changing soil structure. This is the only thing that can ever change soil structure on your farm, is exudates from plant roots. And plants are only going to produce lots of carbon exudates in the very early stages of growth. So please do not put dressings on the seed unless you want to put vermiliquid or compost extract or seaweed or something, milk or something beneficial on there. Please do not put poisons on the seed, because when you do, you're going to prevent this from happening. There is only one thing that can build soil, and that is exudates from living plant roots, and it happens in the early stages of growth. I know I just said that and I've just repeated it because this is very, very important. If you really want to build soil fast, you can put in your cover crop, and then, I don't know, 6-8 weeks later, it depends on your season and everything, you can put another cover crop in over the top of it or graze it, and then you just need to keep it in that early growth stage, because once it switches over from what we call vegetative growth to reproductive growth, it will stop exuding carbon from its roots. Then it puts all of its energy into producing flowers and seeds, and it's forgetting about the soil. It's not building soil anymore. Now that's fine if sometimes you might want to let things go to seed for specific reasons. For example, if you had a permanent pasture and it had something in it like chicory, I certainly recommend at least every 2 years to let the chicory go to seed, because then you don't have to keep replanting it. I mean, the thing about some of these permanent, multi-species forages that we put in, we want them just to get better and better and better over time and not have to keep reseeding them. But if you're looking at really getting maximum recovery of soil in a short amount of time, think about having plants in the vegetative state. That's just a close-up of the same thing. So if we were to, so what is actually going on around, so what I wanted to show you in this photo, in this next diagram, is if we were just to look as a 3D diagram of the soil that's on the left and the soil that's on the right, we'd see something like that. So on the left you have compacted soil. In other words, all the minerals are just pushed down close to each other. They haven't formed into lumps, and if they don't form into these little lumps called aggregates, then there's not going to be any spaces between the lumps for air and water and things to move around. The one on the right is aggregated. So where we have soil particles stuck together, then we've got spaces between them. And the thing that sticks the soil particles together are the glues and gums from the microbes that are being supported by green plants. Better aggregated soil needs more plants. So let's take a close-up look inside one of these aggregates on a plant root. And this is a diagram that was put together by Rudy Garcia with NRCS in Albuquerque. And the green coming down through the centre is a fine feeder root, and then there's some green bits coming off to the sides. They're root hairs that are too fine for us to see with the naked eye. Root hairs only form in biologically active soils. So we won't see root hairs forming to the same extent. It's actually microbes that form root hairs rather than the plant forming root hairs. Now, it's shown as a blue circle because the moisture content inside an aggregate is higher than the moisture content outside, and that's very important for drought tolerance and those kinds of things. The more water-stable aggregates we have in soil, the better the water-holding capacity of that soil. It's also important that it is a unit that has a low partial pressure of oxygen. In other words, it's just like the nodule on a legume. So it doesn't matter whether our plant is a legume or not. It could be a grass, but provided it has rhiza sheaths or it's forming aggregates around the roots, it can fix all of the nitrogen that it needs, because nitrogen fixing will take place in these environments with low partial pressure of oxygen. So a legume has nodules, or should have nodules on the roots. The nodules are little round shapes, or, sometimes not necessarily round, but you know what they look like, I'm sure, on your legumes. If you cut them in half, you'll see that they're high in liquid, should be like a pinkish colour. And if you were to analyse them, you'd find that they're low in oxygen. So they're an environment where nitrogen is being fixed. These aggregates are also environments where nitrogen is being fixed, so the plant can get all of the nitrogen it needs, provided it has rhiza sheaths or is forming aggregates. And that's important because when we have the plant supporting microbes that fix nitrogen, it can also build humus, because humus is a compound that is carbon and nitrogen joined together in the same molecule. Some people think that humus is just carbon, but carbon is just only one part of it. So if we actually look at the components of humus, it is only 60% carbon. It's 6 to 8% nitrogen and it's got a little bit of phosphorus and a little bit of sulphur. When we add all of those things together, they come to about 70%. The other 30% is minerals from your mineral soil. And the kind of minerals that humus pulls out are the things that we don't want to have in excess in the soil anyway. Like I don't know how you say it, aluminium, how do you say it? We call it aluminium. Can someone say it for me? Aluminum, I'll have to try and remember how to say that. Okay, aluminum and iron are the minerals that generally end up being pulled out and sequestered into that humic molecule. So when we have soils that are building humus, rapidly building humus, they're pulling aluminum out of solution, which is really good because aluminum in solution can be very toxic to plant roots. And I'm not sure whether it's an issue here in this part of the world, but in many other parts of the world, having a lot of high levels of available aluminum is actually very toxic to plant roots. So this is what humus is made for. Now that nitrogen that's in there needs to be fixed by microbes inside that aggregate because they're going to join all of these elements together. It's all very well to say that's what humus has got: carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur in it, but what does it actually look like? So this is what the humic molecule looks like. All those different elements are joined together in a polymer, and who did that? Who joined the carbon to the nitrogen, to the phosphorus, to the sulphur, to the calcium and the aluminum and the iron and everything else that's in there that makes up the humic molecule? That takes an enormous amount of work to do that, a huge amount of energy. So the microbes that had to produce special enzymes to form that polymer had to get all of their energy from a plant. Again, there is nothing else that can ever build soil other than a living plant that is supporting the microbes that are sticking all these elements together to make basically topsoil, to make friable, porous, high quality topsoil. It's going to mean you never have to use fertiliser. And that means that it's going to be so easy to work that ground if you were going to work it or use it for something. I was just going to say something important about, that was what I was going to say. So most of those things that form that molecule came from the air. The carbon came from the air, the nitrogen came from the air, the oxygen came from the air. It's also got hydrogen, and hydrogen came from the air. So what we are doing is forming soil from air. We've got minerals that came from rocks, but if we want to turn them into fertile topsoil, we're going to form it from compounds or elements that came from the air, and the only way to get those elements into soil is green living plant in the young stages. So I call this the liquid carbon pathway. It starts with photosynthesis. We need to have things formed in the leaves translocated to the roots. Again, that will not happen to any great extent if you've put high analysis fertilisers under your seed. Why do you think that would be? So we're going to grow a green plant, it's going to photosynthesise, but then we put high analysis fertiliser under the seed. Why do you think that would stop translocation of all these carbon compounds to the roots? Do you think it does? Do you think nitrogen kills microbes? Nitrogen didn't do it? I said if you put insecticides and fungicides, yeah, of course, because they're poisons. But what if we put some nitrogen under our seed or some water-soluble phosphorus under our seed? Why is it not now translocating all those carbon compounds to the roots? Why does the plant just stop doing that? Transpire away too fast. What do you mean by that?
Because it's not doing it on its own?
It doesn't need it, exactly. The plant can't grow without nitrogen. The plant can't grow without phosphorus. And do you think plants were not around more than 50 years ago? I mean, we've had plants for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. Plants have actually been getting all the nitrogen they need and all the phosphorus they need by supporting microbes to get those things. So we come along and go, we'll just fast track this, we'll just give them some nitrogen, give them some phosphorus, we're going to make them grow faster. And then what we didn't realise was that when you put that stuff right under a seed, it's going to have a really short root system. It's going to grow to where the fertiliser is and go, oh, here, look, I don't have to grow any further. It's going to have a short root system. What happens when the season cuts out and you've got a short root system? What happens if you actually want to have deep roots to build topsoil, nice deep topsoil? You've got to make that plant work. Okay, you've got to make plants work. Do not spoon feed them. Do not put them on welfare. Do not put fertiliser anywhere near a seed. In fact, don't use synthetic fertiliser if you really want to build soil. You will get all the fertility that you need through biological processes if you understand how they work. Okay, so if we step 2, translocation to roots doesn't happen if we have prevented it from happening by putting things in the soil that prevent that. Then we want aggregate formation. How do you know you've got aggregates forming? Get a spade, go out, dig holes, have a look, start to understand, start to recognise what aggregates look like. And then humification is the holy grail, because once we get carbon in a humified form, it's stable for thousands of years. Unless, of course, we lose the soil through erosion, which has unfortunately happened as well. So the first 2 steps of that pathway, photosynthesis and translocation to roots, we've got to have green plants there. And unfortunately, we see an awful lot of land. I just flew from Portland yesterday. Unfortunately, I didn't get all the way here because the airport was closed here yesterday. But I was horrified. In that part of the world, at this time of the year, when it's raining every other day, in fact, it rained every single day that I was there, but it's mild temperatures and moist, there is no excuse for that not being green. And like 75% of the farmland that I flew over yesterday in Portland, Oregon, around Portland, was bare at this time of the year. Like totally crazy, no excuse for it. So we need green. And then if we want to have aggregate formation and humification, we must have microbially active soil. So we've got to really think about these beneficial soil microbes and how we're going to support them. So humus-rich topsoil, which is what we want, it's a product. It's a product of photosynthesis and microbial synthesis. It's not just there. You don't just wake up one morning and find there's topsoil there. It's actually something that we have to produce, and it's photosynthesis, not soil, that forms the base of the pyramid of life. So our pyramid looks like this. If we want to have soil, which is basically a product, topsoil, and it's at the top of that, we've got to have as much photosynthesis as possible. So if we cut photosynthesis in half, for example, by having a crop for some of the year and a bare fallow for the rest of the year, then we're cutting our soil formation in half. In other words, every year our soil is going to go backwards. It's going to be half of what it was the year before, half of what it was the year before. And in between the photosynthesis and the soil, we have to have plant roots and associated microbes. So you have to get really used to using a spade all of the time, digging holes, looking at the roots. What are they doing? What are the microbes doing around the roots? Are there riser sheaths? Are there aggregates forming? Are there water-stable aggregates? Can I do things like slake tests and infiltration tests and these kinds of things to see? So that word photosynthesis, which is the base of our pyramid, photo means light, synthesis means putting together. Photosynthesis means making life from light. That's what that word means. So we just look at this historically and what has happened to agricultural land around the world, but more particularly North America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, South America, where it's been areas that have been colonised by Europeans. At the time that Europeans arrived, they found a landscape that had lots of vegetation, lots of ground cover. Think of your prairies, for example, the American prairies. Beautiful, incredibly diverse, 500 to 700 different kinds of ground cover plants. Not many of them grasses, actually. 10 to 15% of those 700 species were grasses. What do you think the others might have been? They were all things that cows ate. So if they weren't grasses, what were they? There was lots of grasses, but what else? Legumes, forbs. And what happened in springtime? What were the prairies like in springtime? Flowers. Carpets and carpets of amazing flowers, which are full of all kinds of secondary plant compounds that are really, really beneficial for livestock. And that's the one thing that's really missing from our systems now these days, is that we tend to grow things that are, in the grass family like corn or wheat, and not to have that many flowers. We have to think a lot more about integrating flowers into all of our systems. But anyway, just to go back to the story. So Marlon, how much time do I have? Like half a minute, right? 2 minutes. Okay, so I'll just explain this one and then I'll take a break there. So on your left-hand side, you have healthy ground cover, and for that reason, because it was green and it was diverse, unfortunately they didn't put the flowers in this diagram. I should probably go back and draw some on there. Maybe I'll do that. This is a Food and Agriculture Organisation diagram that came out of Rome. But underneath that healthy vegetation, you have healthy soil. And then Europeans, didn't matter which part of the world they went to, we managed to find some way to destroy that ground cover. We either ploughed it under or we grazed it out, or now we spray it out. We just don't like green for some reason. If it's green, kill it, seems to be the thing. So we've got this thing about it looks really tidy if it's all bare, and there's no green plants growing there. So we either burned it or we cultivated it or we sprayed it or we mismanaged it with our grazing, and we ended up with less net primary production, NPP decrease, it says. And as soon as you have less vegetation covering that ground, less green actively growing ground cover, you're going to lose soil carbon. So the third one is soil organic carbon decrease. And then the fourth one is soil moisture decrease. Because if you haven't got carbon in your soil, carbon holds between 4 and 20 times its own weight in water, you're going to lose moisture. So you lose structure, you lose moisture, we lose all the things that we want. The soil hasn't got the ability now to even grow plants like it used to have. It's not the same soil anymore, because now it's just basically a bucket of minerals. And that moisture has all gone off to the atmosphere, and we have huge increases in water vapour. It's not the kind of moisture that forms clouds, unfortunately. It's just invisible water vapour in the atmosphere, and it is the greenhouse gas that has increased to the greatest extent since the Industrial Revolution. So 95% of the greenhouse effect is due to water vapour. And there's lots of science around that. Why we've got this thing about CO2, I have no idea, but there is no science to support that. There is a lot of science to support water vapour as a greenhouse gas, and you're going to start hearing a lot more about it because everybody's finally come out of the closet and started talking about it. So this is what's happened historically. What we need to figure out, obviously, is how to go back the other way, and it's getting that green back into the landscape that's going to help us do that. Now, this photograph was taken in Australia about 2 weeks ago. So much for the end of the Dust Bowl era, right? When was the Dust Bowl era supposed to be? In the 1930s or something? We have not learned a thing in Australia. We still have millions and millions of hectares of land, or millions of acres of land that's bare when it used to be vegetated with beautiful grasslands, and now we have dust storms and all kinds of... In fact, the dust and the smoke from all the fires that we're having as well from Australia has been blowing across to New Zealand and all the way across to South America. They've been complaining about our smoke and our dust. So we haven't really learned a lot. So just to go back to this diagram again, and just to show you one example here of why the presence, or what we can see visually about what green plants actually do. This photograph here is taken from the Western Districts of Victoria, which is a state in Australia where they grow a lot of cereals, and it's a Mediterranean climate like Southern California. So it has a very hot, dry summer and a cool, moist winter. The cereals are grown, by cereals, I mean things like wheat, barley, triticale, oats, those kinds of things, and now canola and other winter growing things, are planted in the fall, grown over the winter, and then harvested in spring, and then all summer the soil is left bare It's either sprayed out to keep it bare or it's cultivated to keep it bare. And we have been doing that for over 100 years in the whole of the southern half of Australia, over about 22 million hectares. We have kept the soil bare every single summer. But prior to, like when Europeans first came, it was completely vegetated for 12 months of the year, and it was actually green over summer because there were warm season perennial grasses and other warm season legumes and things that grew over summer, kept the whole system hydrated. Now this green line that you see here is where there was a fence that had native vegetation growing along it. So it was a fence line that wasn't sprayed over summer, that wasn't cultivated over summer. So for all the time that this farmer's been farming for about 30 to 40 years there, he's never ever tilled that soil, was always no-till. He has used heaps and heaps of nitrogen fertiliser and lots of now more and more insecticide, fungicide. In other words, he is just a very typical Australian farmer. That's how we farmed. Not a lot of cultivation, a lot of no-till, but a lot of chemicals. He took the fence out just to make the two paddocks into one, and where the fence was, in other words, where there was green vegetation over summer, this is a very dry year. It didn't rain didn't rain very much in this. His crop has failed. But where the fence line was, the crop is growing perfectly well, and he would have gone through to harvest. Okay, so the question then arises, who caused the drought? Did we have a drought because we had less than average rainfall? Or did we have a drought because we had less than average rainfall and we've destroyed our soils? And the answer is it's because we've destroyed our soils and they no longer hold moisture anymore because the plants are perfectly capable of growing in good soil. And the reason it's good soil is because it's had something growing in it year round. So now we have Australian farmers planting cover crops over summer. In the first summer they may grow, might get up to your knees maybe, and then they die. And then the neighbour laughs and went, oh, what did you try and grow that over summer for? You know it doesn't rain in summer, why would it grow? Oh, well, we're rebuilding our soil. So then the next year it grew, this high. The neighbour says, well, maybe it rained a little bit or something this year. And then in the third year, like if it's got sunflowers and things in it, it'll be up this high in the third year. Even though it's not raining over summer, but for some reason this summer active cover crop is now growing really high, and the neighbour says, where did you get that drought-tolerant sunflower seed from? I want some of that. Well, actually, it was the same seed I planted 3 years ago when it only grew 6 inches and died, but what I'm doing is building my soil. So remember the one that just grew 6 inches and died, all the exudates that came out in that first early stages of growth, got some aggregates there, got some soil that can now actually hold moisture. That means the next summer it can hold moisture for longer because it's better aggregated soil. So that rains in winter time and it's going to carry that moisture through and so on. We can get to the point of actually rebuilding our soil so that they will grow things over summer like they did 200 years ago. So it's these, yes, I'm getting my head cut off here. So it's the actively growing green plants that support the microbes, remember. The plants are important and the microbes are important, that actually create topsoil. It's a product. And then it's going to be friable, it's going to have a high nutrient status, high water holding capacity. So without these plant-dependent microbes, we actually wouldn't have any topsoil. All right, so after lunch I'm going to explain why this process is different to what many of you think of as, I have to have crop residues, I have to put organic matter into my soil, and why it is that the scientists, a lot of the scientists in universities here in the United States have said, look, we've been doing no-till and we've been keeping our crop residues and we've been adding this many tonnes of organic matter to the soil every single year and it's never increased the carbon level. So that you're wrong. You're wrong that you can build soil carbon. Well, in fact, we have farmers, and some of you, I think a lot of you probably came to Gabe Brown's presentation last year, in March last year, who have built incredible amounts of topsoil. and built incredible amounts of carbon, improved their water infiltration rates. I think Gabe's had something like an 18-fold increase in the rate at which water infiltrates into his soil, all of which some scientists in this country say that can't have possibly happened. It's not a real effect. And it's because they're looking at a different carbon pathway and they're not understanding how carbon actually gets into soil. So after lunch, I'll just very briefly cover that and then have a bit of an in-depth look at some of the microbes that we're now understanding, the ones that move from soil into plants, live in plants and move in and out of plants during their life cycle, because they're the guys that are really important for bringing nutrition to our plants. So I will stop now.
Okay. Thanks, Christine.